The signal arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Humanity's most consequential moment ought to have come on a Friday, maybe, or at the very least during business hours. Instead it came at 3:12 in the morning, Pacific Standard Time, intercepted by a graduate student named Yolanda Ferreira who was running a routine sweep of the L4 monitoring array and who described her reaction later, in a Senate testimony that became famous as, "I just stared at it. I genuinely thought the coffee machine had broken and I was having some kind of blood sugar event." It was not a blood sugar event. It was a modulated tight beam transmission originating from a point approximately 0.3 astronomical units sunward of Jupiter's trailing Trojan cluster. Close enough that whatever had sent it had been sitting there, silent, for God knows how long before deciding to speak. The signal structure was not noise. It was not pulsar scatter or magnetospheric bleed. It was organized, layered, and, this was the detail that made every physicist who reviewed it go quiet for a long moment, it was structured in prime sequences wrapped inside a recursive mathematical framework that no natural process had ever been shown to produce. Somebody was out there. And they had been patient enough to wait until we found them. The UNSC Rapid Contact Protocol, which had been drafted in 2031 after a particularly alarming near-Earth object event prompted a general audit of humanity's emergency response systems, activated within 4 hours. By dawn, Geneva had 3 working groups. By noon, every major government had been briefed. By the following evening, the USS Meridian, a deep space research vessel that had been loitering near the asteroid belt on a geological survey, had been quietly redirected. Its crew of 22 scientists and 6 military liaisons were given a revised mission briefing and told, in language that managed to be simultaneously bureaucratic and existentially terrifying, that their survey mission had been deprioritized in favor of a higher urgency tasking. Commander Adiz Nwosu, the Meridian's captain, read the briefing twice. Then she called her executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Pham Thien Duc, into her quarters and closed the hatch. "They want us to go introduce ourselves," she said. Pham looked at her for a long moment. "How close?" "Matching orbit first. Hold at 50 kilometers until we get a read on their intentions." "And if their intentions are unfriendly?" Nwosu set the briefing tablet face down on her desk. "Then we had a good run." The vessel they approached on the 3rd day was not what any of them had imagined. Science fiction had given humanity a library of alien ship designs. Sleek organic curves, vast geometric monoliths, things that looked like cathedrals built by beings who had never seen a horizon. The reality was more disquieting in its ordinariness. The alien ship was roughly cylindrical, perhaps 400 meters in length, its hull plated in overlapping sections of a dark, slightly iridescent material that the Meridian spectrometers spent 6 hours failing to properly classify. It had protrusions that might have been sensor arrays. It had what appeared to be drive exhaust ports inactive. It was, in the clinical assessment of Dr. Rashid Okafor, the mission's senior physicist, built by engineers solving the same problems we solve. Which is either comforting or terrifying, and I genuinely cannot decide which. They held at 50 kilometers for 18 hours before the alien vessel responded. When it did, it was not with another mathematical signal. It was with something far more startling. A docking invitation. A physical one. A tube extended from the alien hull, slowly, precisely, matching the Meridian standard docking collar geometry with an accuracy that implied detailed prior knowledge of human spacecraft design. Which meant they had been watching. Studying. For longer than the signal suggested. Nwosu convened the crew. She did not make the decision alone, she put it to a vote which was not protocol but felt like the right thing to do when the question was whether to open an airlock for an entity you knew nothing about. The vote was 19-3 in favor of proceeding. The 3 who voted against were the military liaisons, who, to their credit, kept their objections brief and professional and then fell in line. The airlock cycled. The tube pressurized. The atmosphere on the other side registered as breathable, nitrogen-oxygen mix, humidity slightly high, temperature at about 19 degrees Celsius. Someone had done their homework. Nwosu was the first through. Protocol demanded it. She wore no weapon and no suit. The latter was a deliberate choice, a signal of trust she felt keenly in every nerve of her body. Behind her came Okafor and Dr. Lina Vasquez, the mission's xenolinguist, a woman who had spent 15 years preparing for a job that everyone assumed she would never actually have to do. The corridor beyond was dim and smelled faintly of something Vasquez would later describe as ozone and warm stone. The walls were smooth, the floor slightly textured. Recessed lighting ran in strips of a cool blue-green that reminded Nwosu of deep water. And at the end of the corridor, 30 meters ahead, standing very still in the particular way that suggested deliberate effort not to appear threatening, was the first non-human intelligence humanity had ever met face to face. She, and the pronoun came later and was contested and was ultimately accepted because she eventually requested it, was approximately 1.7 meters tall. Bilaterally symmetrical, bipedal. Her skin was a deep, almost mineral blue-gray, with a faint bioluminescent tracery along her temples and the backs of her hands that pulsed slowly, like a resting heartbeat. She had 4 fingers on each hand. Her eyes were large, amber, and possessed a stillness that Nwosu found she could not quite look away from, not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they were watching with a quality of attention that felt almost archaeological, as though she was cataloging everything. She raised one hand, palm outward. She had clearly studied human greeting gestures. Nwosu raised her own hand in return. They stood there for a moment, 2 species at the edge of everything they had ever known, performing a greeting neither of them had invented but both had chosen to offer. Then the alien lowered her hand and from a device at her throat came a sequence of tones, processed, shaped, rendered into something that sat at the frontier of language. Anne Vasquez, who had been recording everything and running it through every analytical framework she had spent 15 years building, leaned close to Nwosu and whispered, "I think she just told us her name." The name, as best as human vocal anatomy could approximate it, resolved over the following weeks into something like Verexelen. She was, as they would learn, an envoy, a diplomat, the daughter of her civilization's governing council. She had been chosen for this mission because she was brilliant, composed, and because, though this detail did not emerge for some time, she had volunteered when no one else would. What none of them knew yet was why. The framework for communication took 11 days. Not 11 days of struggle, 11 days of astonishing, sometimes frightening speed that left Vasquez sleeping 4 hours a night and filling notebooks with a handwriting that became progressively less legible as the work accelerated. Verexelen was not a passive subject in this process. She was an active architect of it, contributing her own analytical tools, meeting Vasquez halfway across the gap between 2 entirely different cognitive traditions with a patience and precision that Vasquez described in her personal log as humbling in a way I didn't expect. I assumed I'd be the expert here. I'm not. We're both figuring this out from scratch and she's better at it than I am. Mathematics first, as it always is. Then spatial reasoning. Gestures, diagrams drawn on the shared tablet interface they improvised from both ships' systems, pointing at things and building a shared index of reference. Then verbs. Motion, cessation, exchange. By day 11 they had something that was not yet language but was more than code. A functional pigeon built on 43 agreed concepts that could be stretched and combined to express perhaps 200 distinct ideas. It was, in the words of Dr. Okafor, enough to be polite. Not enough to be honest. Verexelen was polite. Scrupulously, meticulously polite. She answered questions about her species, which she designated by a term Vasquez transliterated as the Cavith, though she acknowledged immediately that the transliteration was lossy, with careful, measured responses. Yes, they were explorers. Yes, they had found humanity's radio emissions and tracked them back. Yes, they had been observing from the outer system for some time before making contact. How long? A gesture that encompassed her own uncertainty. Long enough to learn the shape of the solar system. Long enough to map the frequencies of human broadcasting. Long enough, Nwosu noted, to design a docking collar that fit the meridian precisely. When she raised this point, carefully through the pigeon, watching Verexelen's bioluminescent tracery for any sign of what she had come to think of as stress patterns, the light sped up slightly when the envoy was processing something difficult. The response was measured and honest in a way that felt almost more alarming than evasion would have been. We study before we speak, Verexelen communicated, or as close to it as the pigeon allowed. It is safer. For both. How long have you been in this system? The bioluminescence quickened. Then, long. When Vasquez later pushed for a more specific answer through a more refined communication framework, the number that emerged, expressed in Cavith time units that took another 3 days to calibrate against the human calendar, was approximately 40 years. The Cavith had been in the outer solar system, silent and watching, for 40 years. Since before the birth of everyone on the meridian. Since before the internet as the crew understood it. Since a time when humanity's most powerful radio transmitters were pointed at the sky and screaming into the void with the cheerful confidence of people who assumed the void was empty. It was not empty. It had been listening. The question that Geneva most urgently wanted answered, and which it relayed through increasingly terse daily briefings to Commander Nwosu, was the one that had animated every first contact scenario ever written by human strategists and philosophers. What do they want? The honest answer, which took several more weeks to construct the linguistic scaffolding to even ask, was complicated. The Kavath were not a single-minded civilization with a single foreign policy. They had a governing council, Varek Solen referred to it as the conclave, composed of 17 species blocks, each representing a distinct regional power within their interstellar community. Humanity, as Varek Solen eventually managed to communicate, was not the first new intelligence the Kavath had encountered. They had a protocol for this, a process, a set of assessments. And the assessments, she communicated with careful precision, and what Nwosu had come to recognize as deliberate restraint, were already underway. The Kavath mission, formally speaking, was evaluation. Not contact in the warm, utopian sense that humanity had imagined, not the exchange of knowledge and the handshake between civilizations. It was assessment. The question being asked by the conclave 17 light-years away, receiving Varek Solen's reports through a communication system that made the Meridian's comms look like tin cans on a string, was a precise and clinical one. Are these beings suitable for inclusion, containment, or removal? Varek Solen did not use those words. She used softer terminology. But Vasquez had grown very good at reading the gaps in the pigeon, the places where precision was being deliberately sacrificed for diplomatic softness, and she brought her translation to Nwosu privately, in the captain's quarters at 2,200 hours on a Wednesday. Nwosu listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Vasquez finished, the captain sat very still for a moment. "She's here to decide if we get to live," Nwosu said. "That's my read, yes. And she's been here 3 weeks and hasn't sent a negative report yet, or we'd probably know. Also my read." Nwosu stood and looked out the small porthole at the alien vessel hanging 50 kilometers distant, its lights steady and cold against the dark. "Then we keep talking to her," she said. "And we keep being exactly what we are. Because if we try to perform something we're not, she'll see it. Whatever she is, she's not naive." It was the right call. It was also, unknown to Nwosu, precisely what Varek Solen had been hoping someone would say, because the envoy had placed a small recording device in a common area of the Meridian's observation lounge 3 days into the mission, and she had been listening. Not out of deception. Out of the oldest instinct in the business of diplomacy, the belief that you learn more about a person when they think no one is watching. What she had learned in 3 weeks was disturbing. Not in the way the conclave feared. In a way far harder to report home. She had learned that she liked them. The log entry was later recovered, translated, and released, with her permission, as part of the historical archive that the United Nations Office of Interstellar Affairs compiled. It remains one of the most widely read documents of the contact era, not because of its diplomatic significance but because of its plainness. The voice of an alien diplomat doing her best to make sense of something she had not been prepared for. Day 22. The xenolinguist, Vasquez, showed me something called a photograph today. A physical print, which they still make, apparently, for personal sentiment. It was of a coastline. Somewhere on the third planet. She called it Portugal. She held it the way my mother holds objects she made with her hands, as though the thing itself carries memory in its material. I don't know what to do with that observation. It doesn't fit the framework. The framework says they are a threat-adjacent civilization, high energy consumption, aggressive territorial expansion, history of internal conflict. The framework is not wrong about any of these things. The framework is also, I am becoming certain, radically insufficient. Varek Solen had been selected for this mission by a process that was, by Kavath standards, rigorous. She was the product of 3 generations of diplomatic service. Her mother had negotiated the Tariff Accords. Her grandmother had been present at the settlement of the Irish boundary dispute. She had been trained since childhood to read motivation, to parse the difference between stated intent and actual interest, to maintain the emotional distance that good diplomacy requires. The distance was not holding. The problem, she recorded carefully in the logs she knew the conclave was reading, was not that the humans were performing goodness for her benefit. She had expected performance. She had expected the crew of the Meridian to be on their best behavior, chosen precisely for their composure and their ability to present humanity in favorable terms. What she had not expected was what she saw in the spaces around the performance. In the arguments. In the expressions of frustration. In the moments when crew members forgot she was watching and were simply themselves. They argued constantly. About resources, about protocol, about what data to share with her and what to hold back. Commander Nwosu and the senior military liaison, a taciturn man named Colonel Reyes, had a disagreement on day 14 that lasted 3 hours and was audible through 2 bulkheads. They raised their voices. Then they went to dinner together and the dinner lasted another 2 hours, and from what Verexelen could observe through the lounge window, they laughed several times. She filed a query to the conclave's behavioral analysis unit. Does conflict followed by voluntary social engagement indicate instability or resilience? The response, after a 6-hour round-trip lag, was, insufficient data. Continue observation. On day 26, there was a medical emergency. One of the junior scientists, a young man named Curry, experienced a severe allergic reaction to something in the ship's environmental system. Verexelen learned of it because the usual morning communication session was cancelled without explanation, and when it resumed 4 hours later, Vasquez arrived with shadows under her eyes and a distracted quality that the envoy had come to recognize as stress. Is the crew member well? Verexelen asked, in what was, by now, something much closer to actual language than pidgin. Vasquez blinked. How did you know someone was sick? You were tired and you rescheduled. In my experience, diplomats only reschedule for death, politics, or medicine. Vasquez almost smiled. He's going to be fine. We were scared for a while. He's 24. Does age affect fear on your world? It makes it worse, I think. When they're young. Verexelen considered this. On Cavith ships, medical emergencies were handled with clinical efficiency. The emotional dimension was acknowledged privately and processed later. She had never seen a senior officer on a Cavith vessel look as visibly shaken by a crew member's illness as Vasquez looked now, not because Cavith didn't care, but because showing it in a professional context was considered, at best, a lapse in composure. May I ask you something outside the formal session? She said. Vasquez nodded. Why did you come? To this vessel. Why did you personally agree to be part of the first contact team? Vasquez was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. Because someone had to, she finally said. And because I've spent 15 years learning to talk to someone I didn't know existed, and I wanted to find out if any of it worked. That's a professional answer. The honest answer is I was terrified and I went anyway because the alternative was spending the rest of my life knowing I didn't. Verexelen was silent for 3 seconds, which was, in her culture, the equivalent of a long pause. Then, I understand that. It is why I volunteered as well. It was the first time she had said that. The first time she had admitted the volunteering, and by implication, that this mission had required a volunteer rather than an assignee. Vasquez noted it. Did not press it. Let it rest in the room between them like something fragile. That evening, Verexelen composed the longest private entry in her mission log. She spent 2 hours on it. At the end, she noted something she had been circling for days without being willing to put in writing. The conclave's assessment framework was built on data from species that expanded primarily through competition and resource extraction. Its threat metrics are calibrated to identify civilizations likely to become adversarial on contact. By every metric in the framework, humanity scores in the elevated risk range. High energy consumption. Territorial expansion velocity. History of armed conflict. I do not dispute any of these data points. I am beginning to dispute the framework's conclusion from them. Because the same civilization that has the highest rate of interspecies conflict in its own history also has the highest rate of interspecies cooperation. They fight their own neighbors and then build institutions to stop themselves from doing it again. They are afraid of dying and they go anyway. I don't have language for what that means yet. The framework certainly doesn't. She did not send this entry to the conclave. She archived it locally. It was the first time in her career she had withheld a log entry. It would not be the last. The conclave met on what humanity would mark as day 41 of the encounter. Verexelen was not present, could not be, given the communication lag, but the session was transmitted in full to her vessel, arriving in compressed form 6 hours after the fact. She read the transcript in her quarters with the lights turned low, methodically, the way she read everything difficult, without rushing, without skipping, allowing each argument its full weight before moving to the next. The session was 3 hours long. It was, by Cavith political standards, brief. The conclave did not waste time on arguments it had already resolved. The arguments it had not resolved were arranged in the transcript into 3 positions. The first, held by 6 of the 17 blocks, was the observation extension. Continue monitoring, gather more data, delay the assessment indefinitely. The second, held by 4 blocks, was controlled integration, cautious diplomatic engagement with strict information quarantine. Tell humanity the Cavith existed, establish minimal contact, share nothing of strategic value until a longer assessment period justified deeper engagement. The third position, held by 7 blocks and therefore commanding a plurality, was what the transcript called, in its formal language, the precautionary resolution. Verexelen had known this term since her diplomatic training. Every envoy did. It was the option that was never supposed to be spoken aloud at a first contact assessment and was always spoken aloud within the first 41 days, because the framework always produced the same read on new species and the framework was built by beings who had learned caution the hard way. The precautionary resolution: withdraw. Retreat without revealing the full extent of Kavath presence in the system. Allow the target civilization's development to continue under observation for a minimum of 2 additional centuries. If, at that point, the threat assessment remained elevated, implement containment measures, which was a phrase whose specific meaning was left, as it always was, deliberately vague in formal transcripts and understood by everyone who read them with complete clarity. In plain language, if humanity was still too dangerous in 200 years, the Kavath would decide what to do about it. The decision would not be a diplomatic one. Verexelen sat with the transcript for 4 hours before she responded. Her response, a formal communication addressed to the conclave, logged and time-stamped and therefore permanently part of the record, was 12 pages long. She had never written a formal dispute in her career. The Kavath diplomatic tradition strongly discouraged unilateral advocacy. An envoy's role was to report, to advise, to synthesize. Not to argue. Certainly not to challenge a plurality decision before the session had even closed. She wrote it anyway. She wrote it because she had 3 days before the conclave reconvened to vote on the final resolution, and because she believed, and said in precise, careful language, that the framework was producing a conclusion from data that the framework was not equipped to interpret. The core of her argument was not emotional, though it was informed by emotion she would not have denied. It was structural. The Kavath threat assessment framework, she wrote, was calibrated on a sample of 14 civilizations. Of those 14, 11 had been expansion-dominant species, civilizations whose primary growth mechanism was territorial and whose social cohesion was achieved through external pressure. Humanity, she argued, was something the framework had not previously encountered, a species whose expansion was driven not by cohesion but by the absence of it. They did not spread because they were unified. They spread despite being fractured, precisely because the fractures created competition, and the competition created velocity, and the velocity, uncontrolled, expensive, sometimes catastrophic, had still, somehow, produced a civilization that was arguing about its own ethics in real time. I have been on this vessel for 41 days, she wrote. In that time I have observed this crew argue about resource allocation, medical ethics, communication strategy, and the correct way to prepare a meal from dehydrated components. I have observed them express anger, grief, fear, affection, and something I can only describe as stubborn humor in conditions of genuine uncertainty. I have observed them disagree with their commanding officer and then follow her orders. I have observed their xenolinguist cry privately at 0300 hours and then appear at the morning session precise and professional and give no indication that the night had been hard. I am aware that 41 days and 22 people do not constitute a civilization-level data set. I am also aware that the framework's 14 prior assessments were conducted entirely from sensor data, without an envoy in close physical proximity. I am asking the conclave to consider whether that difference is significant. She closed with a request, not a demand. She asked for 30 more days. She asked to be allowed to tell Commander Nwosu the truth about the assessment, not as a diplomatic gesture but as a test. She wanted to see what humanity did when it knew it was being judged. The conclave received her dispute at hour 6. By hour 12, 7 of the 17 block representatives had filed responses. 3 were dismissive. 2 were interested. 2 were, and this was unusual enough that she noted it carefully, actively supportive. She had 2 days to wait for the vote. She spent both of them on the Meridian. On the second evening, she sat in the observation lounge with Nwosu, who had taken to sharing her evening meal there, and they sat in something that had become, over 6 weeks, a comfortable silence. The kind of silence you can only share with someone you have stopped performing for. You seem preoccupied, Nwosu said eventually. I am. Want to talk about it? Verexelen looked at the captain for a long moment. The honest answer was, yes, but I'm waiting to find out if I'm allowed to. The answer she gave was, not yet. But soon, I think. Nwosu nodded as though that were a perfectly ordinary answer, because she was the kind of person for whom it was. She finished her coffee. She looked at the stars. She was comfortable with uncertainty in a way that Verexelen had come to think of as either wisdom or damage or both. The vote came back at 0400 hours ship time. The result was 9-8. 1 more day. She had won 30 more days by a single vote. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up and went to find Vasquez because she had something to say and she needed the right words, and the right words were still, after 6 weeks, a collaborative project. He told Nwosu at 9 in the morning, which was not planned but felt, in retrospect, inevitable. The captain had been on her way to the bridge. Verexelen had intercepted her in the corridor with a particular kind of deliberate casualness that both of them would later acknowledge was not casual at all. She asked if they could speak privately. They went to Nwosu's quarters. Verexelen told her everything. Not in the careful, negotiated language of the formal sessions, but directly, with Vasquez translating in real time, keeping up through what Vasquez would later describe as the most intense 45 minutes of her professional life. The Cavath, the 40-year observation, the assessment framework, the precautionary resolution, the vote, the 30 days. She told it in order, without softening the hard parts, because she had decided that the only version of this conversation worth having was the honest one. She watched Nwosu's face throughout. She had become, over 7 weeks, reasonably good at reading human facial expressions, good enough to distinguish controlled response from suppressed response from genuine calm. What she saw on Nwosu's face was none of these. It was something she needed a moment to identify. It was the face of someone doing math, working through implications methodically, moving from fact to consequence to next fact without letting any single piece derail the sequence. It was the face Verexelen's mother made when assessing a treaty proposal. It was the face, she thought, of someone who had always known something like this was possible and had simply been waiting to find out the specific shape of it. When she finished, Nwosu was quiet for 11 seconds. Verexelen counted. Then, what happens at the end of 30 days? The conclave votes again. With my report. And if your report doesn't change the plurality? Then they implement the resolution. Which means withdrawal and 2 centuries of observation. At minimum. Nwosu's jaw tightened fractionally. And if we're still too dangerous in 2 centuries? Was not a question. Verexelen answered it anyway, because honesty was the thing she had come here to offer. Then the conclave will have to make a decision I hope they never have to make. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Which is a very long time in a small room between 2 people who are each trying to figure out what the other needs. Then Nwosu said, "Why are you telling me this?" It was the question Verexelen had known was coming. She had prepared an answer. The diplomatic answer, that transparency was strategically beneficial, that informed subjects of assessment produced better data, that the conclave itself had not forbidden disclosure. All of that was true. None of it was complete. "Because you deserve to know," she said instead. "Because I asked for 30 days and someone in your position should understand why those 30 days matter. And because..." She stopped. Started again. "In 44 days, I have watched your crew face an impossible situation with honesty and imperfect courage and a great deal of coffee and what I can only describe as stubborn affection for each other. I have watched your xenolinguist build a language from nothing because she cared enough about getting it right. I have watched you make decisions you weren't certain of and not pretend certainty you didn't have. I volunteered for this mission because the conclave needed someone willing to go, and no one else would. I did not expect to come back genuinely uncertain whether my own civilization's framework for assessing yours is adequate. I am now uncertain. That uncertainty is, I think, information the conclave needs. But it is also, frankly, mine, and I am tired of carrying it alone." Vasquez stopped translating for a moment. When she resumed, her voice was careful and precise in the way it got when she was translating something she wanted very much to get exactly right. Nwosu looked at Verexelen for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, put her elbows on her knees and said, "What do you need from us? I need to show the conclave something their framework cannot generate from sensor data alone. Which is evidence that your species is capable of response to threat that is not defensive aggression. The framework predicts, given the information I've just given you, that your next action will be to either attempt to disable my vessel or to contact your government for military support." Nwosu was quiet. "Then, what's the third option the framework doesn't predict? That you ask me what I need. Which I just did. Which you just did." Another silence. Different quality. Something had shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with the operatic weight that the history books would later impose on it, but in the small, definitive way that real shifts happen, which is quietly and without announcement. Nwosu straightened. "I need to brief my crew. And Geneva. And then I'd like to have this conversation again with everyone present who should be part of it. Can you give me 2 hours? I can give you 30 days. 2 hours first," Nwosu said, and there was something in her voice that Varek Solen had learned over 7 weeks to identify as dry humor in the face of extremity. Let's start with 2 hours. She did not contact Geneva for military support. She briefed the crew fully and accurately, and then she opened a channel to Geneva and briefed them with equal accuracy and made a recommendation, her own, unsolicited, that no military assets be repositioned and no escalatory protocols be initiated. She cited judgment and precedent and the specific phrase diplomatic momentum in a way that made the senior UN official on the other end of the line very quiet for a long time before agreeing. Varek Solen recorded the entire interaction through the passive sensors she had never admitted to having. She wrote a report that was 12 pages longer than any she had previously filed. She sent it to the conclave with a personal note that contained, at the end, a single line she had never used in a professional communication. I believe I may have been wrong about the framework, and I believe that matters enough to say plainly. The 30 days were not quiet. They were the most professionally complicated 30 days of Varek Solen's life, and she had once spent 6 weeks mediating a territorial dispute between 2 Kavath blocs who had been shooting at each other's mining platforms for 15 years. This was worse because the stakes were higher and because the opposition was not external, it was internal, which is always the more exhausting kind. 3 of the conclave's 17 blocs filed formal objections to her continued involvement within the first week. The objections were, superficially, about protocol. An envoy who disclosed the assessment process to the assessed subject had introduced contamination, the argument ran, and the data generated after that disclosure was therefore unusable. Varek Solen replied that the objection was technically valid and substantively wrong, because the whole point of the disclosure was to generate data that the pre-disclosure framework could not produce. The blocs were not persuaded. The argument went to a procedural subcommittee and was still being argued there when the 30 days ended. Her mother called on day 12. Not through official channels, through the private family communication frequency that Varek Solen had carried with her on every posting since her first deep space assignment, when she had been 23 and terrified and too proud to say so. I've read the reports, her mother said. Her mother's voice had the particular quality of someone choosing their words with the care of a person who had been a diplomat for 50 years and was now choosing not to be one. The 7 blocs that supported you in the first vote, 2 of them have pulled back. I know. That leaves you with 5 against 9. I know. Solen. I know what it looks like, mother. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Tell me why you're certain enough to go to war over it. I'm not certain. That's rather the whole point. The framework treats uncertainty as threat. I think uncertainty might be the most important thing about them. Explain that. Varek Solen pulled up the notes she had been compiling for 3 weeks, not the formal reports, the private ones, the ones where she let herself think without diplomatic scaffolding around every sentence. Every species we've assessed through the framework has had a settled self-concept. They knew what they were. The framework reads that certainty is stability. But certainty can also be rigidity. It can mean a species has stopped arguing with itself about what it should be. The humans argue with themselves constantly. Their philosophical tradition is largely composed of arguments about whether their instincts are good. Their political institutions are, at their best, structured arguments about the same question. They built systems specifically to challenge their own worst impulses. Not because the systems always work, they often fail. But because they keep rebuilding them. That could read as instability. It could. Or it could read as a species that hasn't given up on getting better. I'm not sure those 2 things are the same. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Varek Solen checked the connection. Then, the vote will be close. Yes. And if it goes against you? Then I will have been wrong and the conclave will have been right, and I will learn to live with that. And if it goes for you? Varek Solen looked out the porthole of her quarters at the bulk of the meridian hanging in the dark. She could see the lights of the observation lounge. It was evening ship time and there were people in there. Then we have a great deal of work to do, she said. And I think it will probably be the most interesting work I've ever done. On the human side, the 30 days were not quiet either. The UN Security Council met 4 times. The briefings to national governments produced, predictably, a spectrum of responses that ranged from what Nwosu privately described as admirably calm to deeply unhelpful. 3 governments filed demands for unilateral direct contact with the Kavath vessel. 2 others demanded withdrawal of the Meridian and replacement with a military asset. 1 government released the entire situation to its state media before the UN had finished its own assessment process, which generated a week of global chaos that Nwosu watched from 50 kilometers away with the helpless expression of someone watching a natural disaster through a window. Vasquez worked 18-hour days. She and Verexelen were building something in those 30 days that went beyond the diplomatic. A record, a shared document, a foundation. They were producing the first true bilingual lexicon between humanity and an alien civilization, and they were doing it under time pressure and political pressure and the specific pressure of knowing that the document they were building might never be used if the vote went the wrong way. On day 28 they worked through the night. They were translating a set of Kavath philosophical texts that Verexelen had brought in her personal archive, not official material, books from her own shelves, things she had read and reread. By 0400 hours they had reached a passage from a Kavath thinker whose name translated roughly as, the one who questions the questioner, and the passage was about the relationship between caution and cowardice, and how a civilization that could not tell them apart was in danger of mistaking one for the other. Vasquez looked up from her notes. Did you bring this deliberately? Verexelen's bioluminescence pulsed in a pattern Vasquez had learned, over 10 weeks, to read as the equivalent of a rueful smile. The book is 40 years old, she said. I've been arguing with it since I was 12. I thought you might want to as well. Vasquez read the passage again. Then she wrote a response in the margin of her notebook, in English, not in the shared lexicon, and turned the notebook so Verexelen could see it. It was not a translation. It was a rebuttal, written in the argumentative tradition of her own philosophical culture, engaging the 40-year-old Kavath text as though its author were in the room. Verexelen read it slowly. When she finished, she looked at Vasquez for a long moment. Then she picked up the notebook and wrote her own rebuttal, in the Kavath script she had been teaching Vasquez for weeks, directly below Vasquez's. They argued about it until 0600. It was, by any measure, the most important conversation neither of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. He conclave voted on day 74 of the encounter, which was day 30 of Verexelen's extended mandate. The vote was 10-7 in favor of what the resolution termed Graduated Engagement Protocol, the first time in the Kavatha's recorded history of first contact assessments that a new civilization had moved from the preliminary stage to active diplomatic status within a single envoy's posting. The 3 blocs that had previously filed objections to Verexelen's conduct abstained, which was not the same as support but was also not opposition, and which everyone who read the record carefully understood as the particular Kavath diplomatic gesture that translated roughly as, "We disagree with the process but we are not willing to die on this hill." Verexelen received the result at 0312 hours ship time. She read it once. Then she sat very still in her quarters for a while, not because she was processing it but because she had been running at maximum intensity for 74 days and her body had simply, quietly, decided it needed a moment. Her bioluminescence dimmed slightly, a sign in Kavath physiology, not of sadness but of the specific exhaustion that comes after sustained high-stakes effort. The system powering down just a little. The body claiming its due. She went to find Nwosu at 0400 hours. The captain was, unsurprisingly, awake. She appeared to sleep 3 hours a night as a matter of personal policy, which Verexelen had catalogued early as either remarkable discipline or mild dysfunction and had eventually concluded was both. They met in the observation lounge. The lights were low. The stars were bright through the viewport. The alien vessel hung where it had been for 74 days, steady and patient in the dark. Verexelen told her the result. Nwosu was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does graduated engagement mean in practice?" "It means the conclave will appoint a formal diplomatic delegation. It means information exchange under structured protocols. It means, eventually, a direct channel between your governing bodies and ours, though that is years away and will require more work than this." "More work than this?" Nwosu repeated, with the dry tone she used when a statement was simultaneously precise and absurd. "We built a language from scratch and argued our way off an extinction list. More work than this is a high bar." "The bar does not get lower," Verexelen said. "I'm sorry for that. I cannot make the conclave simpler than it is. Don't apologize for it. You went to war with it for us. Not for you. For the correct assessment of the data." Nwosu looked at her steadily. "Sure," she said, and her tone made it clear she believed approximately half of that, and was too fond of Verexelen to argue about the other half. The history of the contact era, as it came to be called, was written and rewritten many times in the years that followed. It was rewritten as humanity processed what it meant, not just politically, not just scientifically, but in the deep cultural sense that takes decades to fully metabolize. It was rewritten when the Kavath formal delegation arrived. It was rewritten when the information exchange protocols began producing results that remade physics and medicine and half a dozen other fields. It was rewritten every time a scholar found a new document in the archives, a new detail that complicated the simple narrative. The simple narrative was, a brave alien diplomat defied her civilization to save humanity. It was not wrong. It was also not complete. The complete story was stranger and more interesting. It was a story about a framework that was not wrong but was insufficient, and about the specific kind of courage it takes to tell the people who built the framework that it needs revision. It was a story about 22 human beings on a research vessel who did not know they were being judged and, when they found out, did not become their best selves or their worst selves, just their actual selves, with all the contradiction and imperfection and stubborn, persistent decency that implies. It was a story about a linguist who built a language in 11 days and argued with a 40-year-old book at 4 in the morning. It was a story about a captain who asked, "What do you need?" when the framework predicted she would ask for weapons. And it was, centrally, a story about what Verexolen actually defied. Not her species. She loved her species, served her species, believed in the institutions her species had built over millennia of painful and occasionally catastrophic political development. What she defied was a specific conclusion drawn from a specific framework applied to a specific situation that the framework had not been designed to handle. She defied the assumption that the data was complete. She defied the institutional tendency to mistake caution for wisdom. It cost her something. It always does. She was passed over for 2 postings in the years following, not officially, but the Cavith Diplomatic Corps was a small world and decisions had a way of expressing themselves through assignment rather than censure. The 3 blocks that had objected to her conduct never formally withdrew their objection. It remained in the record. She was aware of it, noted it in her memoirs with the measured precision of a person who had made peace with the costs of a decision while still believing the decision was right. She and Vasquez maintained contact for the rest of their lives. The correspondence became one of the primary documents in the contact archive, not because it was diplomatically significant, though it was, but because it was the longest sustained cross-species intellectual exchange in recorded history, and because the two of them, over 40 years of letters, managed to do something that no formal protocol had achieved. They genuinely changed each other's minds. Multiple times. On multiple subjects. In both directions. Nwosu retired from active command 5 years after the contact and spent the following decade writing a memoir that was, by all accounts, less interested in the historical significance of what she had done than in the texture of the 74 days themselves, the specific coffee that the Meridian's machine produced, the way the observation lounge smelled, the particular quality of silence between her and Verexolen that had, over weeks, moved from professional to something with no clean, professional name. The memoir was called 50 Kilometers, which was the distance they had maintained between vessels throughout the encounter, and it sold 12 million copies and was translated into 47 languages and was almost universally described by critics as not what you'd expect, which was, Nwosu said in the one interview she gave about it, exactly what she'd intended. Verexolen read it. She found a copy of the Cavith translation in Vasquez's next letter. Vasquez had arranged the translation herself, through the formal exchange protocols, which had taken 6 months of paperwork, which was itself very human in a way that made Verexolen, reading the note, feel something she had come to recognize as the specific warmth of being known well by someone who has decided to know you well. She wrote back, "The translation is adequate. The book is better than adequate. Please tell Commander Nwosu that the particular coffee is mentioned in my own notes, and that I found it truly terrible, and that I drank it every morning anyway because it seemed rude to refuse, and that this was perhaps the most diplomatically significant sacrifice I made on the entire mission." Vasquez told her. Nwosu laughed until she cried, which was, Vasquez said in her reply, a very specific and beautiful laugh, and Verexolen should know she'd caused it. That exchange, that small, undignified, entirely human moment, was not in any official record. It was in the private correspondence, which was donated to the archive 20 years later by Vasquez's family after her death, and which researchers have been mining ever since for the things that didn't make it into the formal documents. The texture of the first 74 days, the sound of a language being built word by word, the quality of the silences between people who were trying, under extraordinary pressure, to simply see each other clearly. What the record shows, in the end, is not a story about humanity being exceptional in the ways the genre traditionally celebrates, not stronger, faster, more warlike, more inventive. It is a story about humanity being exceptional in a way that is harder to see from the outside. The capacity to be genuinely seen in all our contradiction and noise and terrible coffee, and to let that seeing change something in the one doing the seeing. To be assessed by a framework and make the assessor question the framework. Not through argument or threat or display of capability, but through 74 days of simply being, imperfectly and honestly, what we are. Verexelen said it better, in the address she gave to the Cavith Diplomatic Academy 3 years after the contact, which has since been translated and taught in universities across 2 species. What surprised me about humanity was not their strength or their technology or their history. It was their embarrassment about their history. I have never encountered a species that argued so fiercely and in public about whether it deserved to survive. That seems at first reading like a weakness. I have come to think it is the opposite. A species that has stopped asking whether it deserves to survive has also stopped trying to deserve it. Humanity has not stopped trying. I find that, of everything I brought home with me, the most important thing to report. The vote had been 10-7. 1 block's shift in either direction would have changed everything. History is full of moments that hinged on a single vote, a single voice, a single person willing to write 12 pages no one asked for. The hinge is always smaller than the door. Verexelen went home eventually. She returned to the outer solar system twice more in an official capacity, and once, many years later, retired and acting purely on personal inclination. She arranged passage on a Cavith research vessel that was passing through the inner system on a routine survey and asked the captain if they could briefly hold position near a particular point in Earth orbit. The captain, who had read the memoirs of both women and knew exactly why she was asking, complied without comment. She spent 2 hours at the viewport. She did not record what she was thinking. Some things are not for the archive. Some things are just for the person looking out the window at a blue-green world that is, in all its noise and argument and terrible coffee and stubborn imperfect decency, still there, still trying, still, against considerable odds, trying.